Ladies and gentlemen, again, welcome to our lecture series, Spotlight Cultural Property Protection. My name is Anna Kaiser. I am the head of the Center for Cultural Property Protection at the University for Continuing Education in Krems in Austria. The center was founded in 2015, and since 2016, we host a lecture series on different topics of cultural heritage protection. And this year, we celebrate the 70-year anniversary of the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict from 1954, and thus we have dedicated our lecture series in 2024 to this convention. I am honored to say that the 2024 lecture series takes place under the patronage of the Austrian UNESCO Commission and in close collaboration with esteemed colleagues and institutes from around the globe, with the American University of Rome, the Office of Cultural Affairs of Liechtenstein, the Carabinieri Command for the Protection of Cultural Heritage, the Heidelberg Center for Cultural Heritage, the Yildiz Technical University in Turkey, the French Foreign Legion, Swansea University, and, most important for this evening, the Austrian Armed Forces and the CURIA Lab for the Conflict Observatory. And I'm especially honored to introduce this evening's chair, Dr. Laurie Rush, who is the leading expert in military cultural property protection. She serves as anthropologist and archaeologist in the 10th Mountain Division, which is the most deployed division in the US Army. And with them, she has been deployed to several missions abroad, and based on that experience, has basically brought cultural property protection into the 21st century. Dr. Rush, dear Laurie, it is a great privilege to have you hosting this evening and sharing it. And with that, I hand over to you and look forward to a great evening with our distinguished speakers.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anna and Rafaela, the organizers and supporters of this webinar. It is an honor to be asked to chair this panel, especially with our two distinguished guests. If you had told me 20 years ago, in 2004, that I would look back at that time and think that teaching cultural property protection to U.S. military personnel with simple lessons like please don't put huge weapons and dig into Mesopotamian city site tells. And if I was thinking back, and now that seems like a relatively simple challenge, and the key word is indeed relatively. And I wouldn't have believed you if you had told me that it was relatively simple. But now, as we look at the complexity of the cultural property protection challenges we face in current global conflicts, the lessons of 2004 seem very straightforward. Not only compromising the high ground in the Middle Eastern river valleys, but not parking in cemeteries or setting up protective perimeters around museums. How to recognize an ancient water system. All of those seem like relatively simple pieces of advice. And that's because today we're facing adversaries who mobilize cultural property strategically as a component of sophisticated information operations, along with proactive efforts to rewrite history and erase the identities of others. Changes and challenges like these make webinars like the Spotlight series so critical for those of us who care about saving heritage and protecting communities in the midst of disaster and armed conflict. These meetings offer an opportunity to step back, to consider our work within the context of the larger global issues, but also the context of time and change. And with that, it is my privilege to introduce our first speaker, Major Albin Rentenberger. Major Rentenberger is a military expert on the war in Ukraine for the Austrian Army. He is the head of training and a researcher at the Institute for Higher Military Leadership at the Austrian National Defense Academy in Vienna. He's a graduate of the Austrian General Staff Officers course and also a graduate of the University of Vienna, the Theresian Military Academy at Wiener Neustadt, and the Austrian Defense Academy, where he has earned a master's degree in military leadership. From April to December of 2019, Major Rentenberger was the military assistant to the mission force commander for the European Union training mission in Mali. And in 2017, he was the company commander for a reconnaissance company serving in the NATO KFOR mission in Kosovo. Today, Major Rentenberger will share his research and experience as he discusses the ongoing suffering of the civilian population in Ukraine and damage to infrastructure there. He will provide an overview of the phases of war and strategic objectives of the warring parties. He will focus on the Kharkiv region as he discusses his detailed analysis of the current situation regarding cultural property protection. Major Rentenberger, the floor is yours.
So good evening, everybody. It's an honor to present my researches about the cultural property protection. And if you look at this picture taken in Ukraine, we see the importance of the topic. When we look at this devastation of cities, of the suffering of the civilian population, as we see here, that's an important topic. I propose this following agenda. After a short introduction, I will explain the war in 6 phases, and then we will do this deep dive into the Kharkiv region, having in mind this cultural property protection aspect, and then I will try to give an outlook for this war, how it could end or how it could continue. So I propose the first slide is, or when you're a military, you always look at the objectives at first, the desired end state. And if you look at the objective of Vladimir Putin, so it's a demilitarization of the Ukraine, and Russia wants to prevent the Ukraine from joining NATO and the European Union. We see that this objective is far from solved. So, but the minimum objective is the whole control of the Donbas with the Oblast of Luhansk and Donetsk. If you look at the objective of the Ukraine, you can sum it up with one word. It's actually survive. And they try to restore the borders from 1991, but also the Ukraine is far from hitting these goals. So, and if you look at the current situation, we see that there's no compromise inside at the moment. The war is also a cognitive war, a war about narratives. And there are 4 narratives that we can identify if we look at this war. First, the Russian narrative is quite simple. Ukraine must be denazified. This is the term used by Russia. So Ukraine doesn't exist, it's not a state, there is no culture in Ukraine. For the Ukrainian, Russia must lose. But we see that in the western part, in the NATO, we have actually 2 different narratives, and there is a slight difference between Russia must lose and Russia must not win. And we see that some partners of NATO are more in the one camp and others are more in the other camp. And so this is a small difference, but we see this in the support of Ukraine, that there is a difference. And then we should not forget that the world is not only the Western world, but there is also the so-called global South. And we hear a lot of the narrative over there is more, this is Europe's war, we don't care about it. You don't care about our conflict, so why should we care about this conflict? A white man's war was called also. And so we shouldn't forget this aspect as well. So why is it important for the cultural property protection? Well, if you say, if it's a part of this Russian narrative, is there is no Ukrainian culture, then this is a big problem regarding the protection of this culture, because this was always a part of war. You dehumanize the opponent, and also if you're neglecting the culture, then it gives you perhaps the right to attack this property that should be protected, actually. What we observe since September 2022 is that Russia conducts strikes in the strategic depth in the rear area of Ukraine. They attack especially the energy supplies, so the critical infrastructure. They attack the defense industry, but by cutting the energy supply, this could lead also to a humanitarian catastrophe. And one aim of this campaign is also to breaking the will of the population to fight. And this strategic bombing campaign by ballistic missiles, by drones, is also a part this attacks on cultural heritage, cultural property. So this is a big question. Is this a targeted campaign to destroy Ukrainian culture? Or is this just collateral damage? And this is a difficult question to answer. And sometimes, for sure, it's perhaps only collateral damage. We should not forget, even if you with your air defense, you can shoot down the ballistic missiles, the drones, the debris. They are causing damage. But sometimes, and this is quite clear, there are targets, museums, for example, as we see on the left pictures, who are targeted really on purpose. And this is an indicator that there is a targeted campaign to destroy Ukrainian culture. Another example here, not a direct hit, but also the damage for an example from Kharkiv with the Dormitio Cathedral. There are also some reports about plundering ongoing. Here, an example from Kherson Museum of Arts, when Kherson was occupied by the Russian Armed Forces. So the close historical ties between Russia and Ukraine have given additional special aspect to this conflict in this regard. I will now switch to the 6 phases of the war and to explain, to give you an overview what happened actually since the February 22. But I have to say that this war is actually ongoing since 2014 with the annexion of the Crimea. But the big invasion started in February 22, and I will focus on this area, on this period. So we had at the beginning this failed blitzkrieg, failed attempt, we could even call it a coup d'etat. It was the Russian armed forces tried to get to Kiev very quickly and in order to conduct a change in the government. Actually, it was very surprising for many military specialists, but the Ukrainian could defend Kiev, and this led to a lot of casualties on the Russian side. And so there was a reboot of this whole campaign. Russia took back all his forces from the north. And after April 22, there was a new phase. There was a new strategic objective also from Vladimir Putin. They had to accept that there will be no quick win in the Ukraine, like they were perhaps used to from 2014 in the Crimea. And so there was a war of attrition started in the Donbas area. So in the area of the Oblast, Luhansk and Donetsk, Russia started with its classical doctrine style, very focused on fires, on artillery fire, to do some progress in this area and to get step by step more territory from the Ukraine. In the fall, September 22 and November 22, there were 2 major Ukrainian counteroffensives, one in Kharkiv, we will look at this more in detail, and one in Kherson, where the Ukrainian surprisingly had a big win. They could regain a lot of their territory, and this gave a lot of hope for the upcoming year 2023. The Ukrainian started to prepare a counteroffensive with actually already Western war material, but this period from December to May, we call it the loss-making stillstand, because there was a lot of fighting ongoing, but the front was nearly unchanged in this period. The most famous happening in this time, in this period, was the siege of Bakhmut, which I think you all remember from the media at the time. The long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive started in June, and you have to say now, looking back, that this was a failure. The Ukrainian gained only very few square kilometers back, and these pictures from Western armored main battle tanks stuck in minefields, they were a big, not a big game changer, but this was a very upsetting for the Ukrainian, and also made clear that a realistic counteroffensive, or the chance to get back the territory, is quite small. The hopes from the September 22, they could not be fulfilled in this time. And now, since December, we have to say that Russia has the initiative again. And I will focus now more on this current situation. We say would be the phase 6. Some experts call it already the phase 7. What is the situation like? We have a Russian offensive in Donbass. Here is the main effort. Troops are heading for Pokrovsk, a very important city for the Ukrainian supply. And I would not say the last, but a very important defense line for the Ukrainian in the Donbass. We have also, since May 24, a new front. You see it on the picture on the left, near Kharkiv, which is also a problem for the Ukrainian forces, which have a lack of personnel and material. And so a new front is always a challenge in this regard. The strategic bombardments that I mentioned before, they are still ongoing, and even the 26th of August, for example, was a very, very harsh day for Ukraine, and they are ongoing and becoming even worse, which is a big problem when we think about the coming winter, who could be very cold and very difficult especially for the civilian population. The Ukrainian tries on their side to hit targets in Russia, especially the oil infrastructure, with their drones, with their missiles. But they have some spectacular success, but it's only on a small base scale compared to the Russia strategic bombardment campaign. Then we had this very surprising attack in the Kursk region, which I will I'll talk about in a few seconds. So let's do to this deep dive. Kharkiv, a city, the second biggest city in Ukraine. And I chose this topic because I wanted to show the military connection between the cultural property protection and the military aspects regarding this city. So at the beginning, this phase 1, you see again this start of the invasion. We see that Kharkiv was captured, was occupied in the beginning of the war. And then came this situation in the fall 2022, this Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv that I talked about. And there was a very good deception actually from the Ukrainian side. Everybody was focusing on Kherson, which you see on the south near the Dnieper, here marked by 2. Russia was very busy with the Donbass, and President Zelensky said, we will retake reconquer the Crimea. And as you see on the red arrows, Russia tried to maneuver some troops from the north, from Mariupol, to this area because they were afraid that there will be a breakthrough in the area of Kherson. What happened? There was a very surprising, successful counter-offensive with actually not heavy brigades, but quite light troops. And they managed to get into the depths. They showed the Ukrainian flag in villages, showed them on social media, and then the Russian fled actually. And this resulted in a lot of Russian losses, and the Ukrainians could gain capture a lot of main battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, as you see here depicted in the left picture. This was a very big success, and perhaps the most successful counteroffensive from Ukraine, perhaps apart the defense of Kiev at the beginning. So Kharkiv was quite safe. Well, it was still bombarded with the strategic bombardments. But then in May 2024, there was this new front opened by the Russians with the aim to fix Ukrainian armed forces, to create a sort of buffer zone for the region of Belgorod, which was also severely hit several times by the Ukraine. And this was also a victory or success in the information environment for Russia, of course. Now, what is the big problem? And this is what I meant by the connection between the cultural property protection and the military situation. Kharkiv was always hit by drones and by ballistic missiles. But with this attack, the Russian army could come into the range of the normal tactical artillery, and this would be very, very dangerous for the people living there, because of course they could spend a lot of more ammunition and make the life of the Ukrainian people in Kharkiv even more difficult. It's already not easy having all these bombing alerts every day, but with this tactical artillery, so when which can reach only 20 kilometers, this would be very, very difficult. And this was also, we think that this is an objective of the Russians, also to make the living in Kharkiv city very so impossible that people must fled and leave the city behind them. This arrow shows this small distance, and yeah, that's why there was this attack in the Kursk region as a liberation strike from the Ukraine. We will see where this will end. They needed a success story, also regarding the rest of the world. We have this US elections soon, and so this is important in the information environment to have a success story, actually, to gain support. For the tactical operational goals, it was important to lure Russian forces from the Donbas area to the Kursk, which didn't went so well. So I come to the outlook for this war. So we have a dangerous imbalance, actually, in a war of attrition ongoing. We have, on the one hand, Ukraine with a little defense industry of its own, which is also always endangered and which can always be struck by the Russians. There, in the West, we have a lack of arms industry. We didn't build it up as we should, perhaps, or we should if we want to support Ukraine in a proper way, actually. And we see that in some countries, there is a sort of support fatigue, war fatigue in some Western countries rising. On the other hand, Russia has a war economy and an expanding armaments industry. They can do it in an unthreatened depth of the country, so they are not endangered to be attacked by the Ukraine. They have powerful partners like North Korea and Iran, who have a lot of possibilities to support Russia, and they have time. Time, why? Because they can wait for November, and November will be, I would say, this is a crucial point in this war. This will be the elections in the US. If Trump wins, he said he will not support Ukraine like the administration Biden did. And even if he doesn't win, we have these pictures, right? We still remember Mr. Bison here. So perhaps some unrest in the US could lead, however the elections end, to a lack of support for Ukraine in the following month. And I will also say there is this Black Swan event we should not forget. in an armed conflict, there's always a possibility that there is a black swan event, means an event that we didn't think about. You can only see it afterwards, perhaps like Yevgeny Prigozhin walking against Moscow. Yeah, this could be called like an event like this, and this could change, of course, the conflict. But I cannot tell you what this could be, because then it wouldn't be a black swan anymore. So from our risk assessment in the armed forces, the title is Die Welt aus den Fugen, and you could call it the New World Disorder. And we will say if this is just a start between a conflict between the global South and the West, and if we are on the road to a new world order. And regarding the cultural property protection, we have to say that what about the law of the armed conflict and the international law? And if we look at this conflict, we see, unfortunately, then that this law is in decline because one of the biggest players is not following it, and there are no sanctions how you could assure that this law is respected. That concludes my briefing. I hope that I could give some views on this conflict in the Ukraine war, and I'm eager to respond to your questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Major Rentenberger, for that excellent presentation. Now it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Katherine Harrell. Dr. Harrell has her PhD from the University of Sheffield in the UK in archaeology and archaeological science. Her extensive experience in the world of cultural property protection includes senior positions at the Virginia Museum of Science, the State Department, and Defense Intelligence Agency. She is currently a student at the University of Virginia Law School and director of the CURIA Lab for the U.S. State Department Conflict Observatory. Dr. Harrell serves in the U.S. Naval Reserve and is a member of a new U.S. Coast Guard auxiliary unit that focuses on cultural property protection. Today, Dr. Harrell is going to share with us insights from her extensive experience incorporating cultural heritage information into intelligence analysis for improved mission planning, documentation of cultural property to meet forensic standards for war crimes prosecution, and educating military personnel for more sophisticated understanding of the role of cultural property in information operations. The newest CURIA Lab report coming out of their analysis, the CURIA Lab analysis of Ukraine, sets a very high bar for in-depth analysis and documentation of cultural property damage. Dr. Harrell, the floor is yours.
Laurie, thank you so much. I am a student of Laurie's forever, for life. Majors, wonderful to follow you. Let me open with a disclaimer that everything I'm about to say reflects my own personal views and is not a reflection of the U.S. government in any capacity or the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary. And if anyone has any problems or has any further questions about that, they can contact me. But again, to reiterate, these are my own opinions. So today I want to talk about thinking about cultural heritage and working towards protecting cultural heritage within the steps of JIPO, which is Joint Intelligence Preparation of the Operational Environment. I'll explain what that is in a second and why we care. And also more broadly, thinking about how Hague 1954 might be applied to wars that don't look like the one that Hague was written in response to. I.e., how do we apply a mid-20th century convention to the threats of the 21st and 22nd century that cultural heritage is facing? So a little background about what JIPO is. As mentioned, I'm in the reserves. As an intelligence officer, I was formerly active duty as well. And there's a joint product called JIPO, the Joint Intelligence Preparation of the Operational Environment. It is a written product that allows operators and decision makers to decide how the information that they need to know before they execute a mission. This is a common type of product within NATO as well. There are 4 steps, and I should say, actually, before I venture into the steps in how we can incorporate cultural heritage protection into them, I should say that JIPOs are generally prepared in advance of situations that might be emergency or dynamic, but are also big enough, and the response is going to be in from a minimum of several hours to maybe a day or up to like approximately 3 days, or they can be prepared well in advance. So a sample, one off the top of my head would be if a situation at an embassy at a country it begins to collapse suddenly, and NATO forces or US forces or Western forces want to evacuate their embassy from that country. The military being involved, they would ask planners to develop this JIPO product. The other name that you might know this product by is IPB, Information or Intelligence Preparation of the Battlefield. Some parts of the US DoD use IPB, but it means the same thing. It has the same 4 steps. Okay. Incidentally, people just kind of sometimes use JIPO in their like normal everyday lives to make a decision about something. So the steps, I think, are very flexible for thinking strategically and doing some planning. So the first step is to define the operational environment. And if I'm going to rely on this hypothetical example of planning a evacuation of an embassy and citizens within that country through the embassy, in the event of like a unstable political activity, coup, war, etc. So defining the operational environment would be literally the specs of the embassy, how many people work there, how many people are in that country that are citizens or foreign nationals that you're going to evacuate. And then like the terrain, city maps will be pulled up, stop signs, for example, and street lights will be mapped. Fire exit doors will be mapped. The operational environment is literally where the operation is going to take place, and any pertinent information that the planners will need to know about the physical terrain. That is the step in which you are going to spell all that out. And of course, this is a perfect opportunity for those of us working in cultural heritage protection to also map the physical terrain of cultural heritage. So those tangible objects and monuments, buildings, infrastructure of heritage, museums, archives, houses of worship, monuments, etc., that are within the operating environment. As I'm going to refer frequently, Laurie, to your lessons from 2004. And for example, pointing out that mounds in the desert are actually heritage and not just geographic or geological mounds, would be part of defining the operational environment, including cultural heritage. Labeling those as protected sites on maps is a very easy first step. But also, let's not just limit ourselves to thinking about defining the operational environment as protecting or a way to locate and sort of put borders around tangible heritage only. Everyone working in this space is very familiar that heritage refers to tangible and intangible. And how we can layer intangible heritage into step 1 is 3 that I'm thinking off the top of my head about are language, activities, and calendar. So telling planners about the local language uses, if there's multiple languages or specific dialects used, and who is using them is always important for planning purposes, as well as like how, for example, using the Department of Defense as an example, they're interested to know like how fluent people are in English, for example. So yeah, language usage, and how that might affect the operational environment. Activities, and here I'm thinking of things like that are cultural in nature, so festivals, rituals, pilgrimages, And all of that maps onto, or frequently maps onto, calendar. So people do these activities at specific periods of time or times of the year. And that would absolutely be part of step 1 of JIPO. So, you know, people continue to practice their cultural behaviors all the time. And if you're going to do a major military operation in an area, the planners definitely want to know, oh, the holy day in this area is Friday, not Sunday, for example. There's a pilgrimage, so you will see masses of civilians moving through the city in July. You know, and so I say this, and it is September 12th. Yesterday was 9/11, and for which many activities, if you were to look at the United States from space and look down on New York and DC, you would see people congregating in special spots to celebrate, memorialize 9/11, right? Those are the types of activities that, if they intersect with the scope of the operation that is intended or planned, planners want to know about. And we should be thinking about incorporating, again, aspects of intangible heritage, because it's changing people's behavior into this step of JIPO. So I already mentioned doing activities on a calendar, but also making planners aware of a calendar, a social calendar or cultural calendar, right? We're interested in things like holidays, holy days, festivals, any special days of memorialization like yesterday, that, again, if they fall within the window or in the vicinity of the window of the planned operation, planners want to know about them. Basically, in this step, I think about presenting this type of information so that planners are aware and can plan around if people's behavior changes because they're doing memorializations or they're attending festivals or they're participating in pilgrimages, etc. Yeah, planners want to know. Step 2 of JIPO is describe the impact of the operational environment. This is a little tricky from kind of step 1, in that step 1 is kind of outlining the whole operational environment, describing its characteristics, like I said, tangible and intangible, and then the impact of the operational environment. And essentially that is a sort of, you could call it maybe a priority list of things that the planners will need to know about that could impact the operation, because they're interruptive or because they're paramount. So, for example, if a pilgrimage is planned for later in the year, but not during the period in which the operation is planned, but people have already started moving from location to location, that impact worth just pointing out in step 2 of JIPO. More generally, for protecting cultural heritage in step 2 of JIPO, this is where heritage professionals need to be emphasizing that minimizing cultural heritage harm, so minimizing harm to cultural heritage, is a lesson learned from when we did not protect cultural heritage, and that was a strategic disaster. We are in a position now, you know, I'm reflecting on Laurie's comments from her introduction. I have to say, one fallout from the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I can walk around and talk to military officers and say, I'm an archaeologist working on cultural heritage protection, and this is an intelligence issue. This is a national security issue. And they get it. They understand that I don't need to make the link between why, like, heritage, studying heritage in and of itself, and why that's a national security issue. They understand, thanks to Russia's abuse of a historizing narrative to justify an illegal war. this is in step 2 of JIPO, we can emphasize this link that protecting cultural heritage, minimizing harm to cultural heritage, is actually a strategic strength for our forces. And that's where I see cultural heritage, big picture of explaining like why it's important and why we need to protect it, is absolutely, I think, part of step 2 of JIPO. Step 3 of JIPO is evaluate the adversary. And this is where intelligence officers work on a JIPO. I should have said this before, so I apologize, but JIPO has the word intel in it, intelligence, but it's not just built by intelligence officers. It's generally constructed by both intelligence and operations officers. So the intel people and the operators. But intel feeds a lot into step 3, which is evaluate the adversary. And generally that means presenting intelligence information or pieces of intelligence about what we know about the adversary. And so those of you that have sat in an intelligence brief on our adversaries, Russia, North Korea, Iran, China, you know what I'm talking about. It's like, what kind of jets do they have and how many? What kind of ships do they have? What are their ground forces like? What's the disposition of their forces, etc. So the question of protecting cultural heritage in step 3, here is where I see where we should be focusing on how our enemy is creating and consuming historizing narratives. This is where we can assess the information operations of our adversaries. So there is a lot of attention paid to Russia's historizing narratives about there is no Ukraine. Ukraine was always Russia. Literally just making up historical facts, rewriting historical facts into a historical fiction to justify this illegal war. There's that attention that is paid in Western media, I think, misses a large part of the fact that we feel like it's aimed at us, that these information operations are aimed at us. And actually, research shows that it's not necessarily aimed at us. It is aimed at the Russian people and then spills outward. We think we're the intended audience, and that might not be wrong, but it is definitely not the whole story. So I point you to Jade McGlynn's excellent book from last year called Memory Makers: The Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia. This is a fabulous book with, I would suggest, a great place for jumping off into the Russian sources. It's an English language book. And understanding that the Russians themselves are being fed these pieces of disinformation and these wrong histories, and they have been for a long time. It wasn't just prior to the full-scale invasion in 2022. Why does this matter? If we evaluate the adversary, understanding that they've been essentially drinking the Kool-Aid for a long time, it helps us understand their battle decisions. Currently, the Russians are not winning this war. They're not losing it either, but they're not winning this war. And they're also repelling an invasion into their own territory. And yet they continue to build new Russian monuments. By the military's the Russian Federation Armed Forces are building new Russian monuments. Some small amount of their military armed forces are building new Russian monuments rather than being at the front lines. They are doing this while they are not winning a war, while they are being invaded by Ukraine. We might think, why would you waste that manpower? Maybe put this on pause and fight the adversary first, and then the monument. Like, what is so urgent about the monument that you have to continue building it, even though you're not doing so great right now, strategically? Answering that question, why are the Russians using valuable manpower to build new Russian monuments while they're not winning a war, is step 3. I will also point you to recently, in the last day or two, there's been controversy about a film being aired at the Toronto Film Festival called Russians at War, and it's created by a filmmaker who is embedded with Russian Armed Forces, and she gives a very sympathetic view of the average Russian in the military. And it's been called propaganda, and I agree that it is. She's being funded by the Russian government, so but she interviews a lot of Russians, and they themselves explain why they are there based on the fact that, or linking their acts to historical acts of World War II, of being related to fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers who fought against the Nazis in World War II, and that they are repeating this kind of history. What I'm saying is the average Russians themselves believe what they are doing is historically the right thing to do. And that explaining that piece, I think, is really important here in step 3. Mostly because the operators, like I said, a lot of operators think that Russian information operations is aimed at us. And that's not really the whole story. I'm going to talk now about step 4, the end. And this is determining adversary COAs, that is courses of action. Generally, in a JIPO brief, you would present the most likely enemy course of action. So in the example scenario of building the JIPO before a evacuation of an embassy, you would present the adversary's most likely course of action once the operation begins, and you'd also present the most dangerous course of action to the operators. And here, in terms of thinking about protecting cultural heritage, I suggest stressing that our adversaries do not think the way that we do. I just brought up the example of some portion of the Russian armed forces are spending their time building Russian monuments, new monuments in Ukraine, rather than actually actively fighting. It's not a strong position for the Department of Defense or NATO. We don't have a monument building cadre. But that doesn't mean our adversaries do not. And that is a psychology and also related activities that we need to be incorporating into military planning. Understanding how our adversaries do not react the way that we would is really important. And here I want to also maybe talk theoretically or consider how Hague 1954, how we can begin to think about its protective status and entitlements in an era where war is not what it was in the mid-20th century, and we are facing war in the 21st and 22nd century, new threats, new areas of battle space, etc. So I would like to address the topic, and here's where these are just ideas. These are just my ideas that I've been thinking about, and I think it is worth thinking about. Not sure that I have the answers here, but I think it is worth asking the question. Where is the line between a legitimate military target and a non-legitimate or illegitimate or no strike list, a non-legitimate military target? The one aspect of the Hague 1954 Convention has been the production of no strike lists. And those are lists provided by advocacy groups, etc., to the military, DoD and NATO, of things that we should not blow up, like churches, museums, but also other areas of civilian infrastructure, right? So what Hague 1954 provided was a definition of what is a legitimate military target, and then by exclusion, things like schools, hospitals are not legitimate military targets. Cultural heritage is not a legitimate military target for the most part. But within that, we are seeing, sorry, let me back up and say Hague 1954 was written in the context of sites in Italy, France, all over Western Europe being bombed. The cathedral at Leiden just absolutely bombed so much that the lead in the walls melted out. That is a type of culture that we all recognize as precious, beautiful, unique, ancient, right? But lots of heritages don't rank to the level of a World Heritage Site. The report that my research group just released is about kurgans, about burial mounds in Ukraine, of which there's thousands, and the ones that we looked at in satellite imagery are unremarkable in terms of being very similar to the other thousands that are out there. Not all of those are on the no strike list, of course not, because there's more heritage out there than people have sat down and recorded or figured out where they are or fed them into the Department of Defense or into to their respective equivalent in other countries. A lot of heritage is just out there and is unmapped or not at the disposal. Its location is not the disposal of military planners. They're not marked with blue shield, the blue shield emblem, etc. So that is one type of heritage, which is like the everyday, unremarkable heritage, right? If we have like world heritage, and then we have just everyday churches, everyday museums, archives, monuments, etc. And then we're starting to get maybe what we can think of as like a new type of heritage, which is things like new Russian monuments in Eastern Ukraine. And some people will call this dark heritage, or dark heritage can also include sites for which they have a complicated history. And so, for example, in the US, we have begun taking down monuments put up in the 1930s that honor Civil War, specifically generals from the South, from the Confederacy. And that it would be an example of like dark heritage, because large parts of the society reject those as monuments for remembrance, commemoration, etc. So we have dark heritage, we have new monuments, and we also have things that, for example, like the Russians they bombed the Mariupol theater, drama theater, killed approximately 650 women and children inside, who were taking shelter inside, and are currently rebuilding it. There is a time when Ukraine regains Mariupol that they will have to decide what to do with the new theater that is sitting on top of a graveyard. All of these are what I would describe as like new monuments, and they come with their own new problems. And should they be protected by Hague 1954 is the basic question. My answer is yes. That this is not to say I don't think monuments should be removed, but we need to be asking questions about whether they are legitimate military targets. And my answer for that is no. Again, Hague 54 protects or identifies legitimate military targets. And I do not think that new Russian monuments are a legitimate military target. Similarly, I don't think, for example, the Kremlin, which is a building on the World Heritage List, is a legitimate military target, just because the Russian military is housed there. So I encourage everyone to think about how Hague 54 should be used to define legitimate military targets when it comes to thinking about heritage that we can't all agree is like the warm, fuzzy feeling of a medieval cathedral or the Louvre, but about things that are contentious, maybe oppressive. Are they legitimate military targets, or are they military heritage? Is that a legitimate military target? Again, my answer is no, but I think it is worth raising those questions here. I say this again under step 4, defining adversary courses of action, because our adversaries do not think the way that we do. And so our answer to whether or not Hague 54 identifies new Russian monument or a re-erected Soviet monument as actually a legitimate military target, our answer to that does not determine what our adversaries will answer to that question. And so in order to do cultural heritage protection of our own heritage and also heritage worldwide, we need to be aware that this question needs to be asked. We need to come to terms with answers with it, and we need to understand that our adversaries might not answer it the same way that we do. That's all I have, and I'm happy to take questions, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kate, for your brilliant analysis, and that certainly raises all kinds of interesting questions for both you and the major. My first question would be to both of you: if you are going to advise the Ukrainians in terms of intelligence gathering and response, are there ways where you could see them giving themselves a little bit more strategic advantage if they began to incorporate cultural property protection into their that JIPO analysis process that you just outlined?
Sure. So my response to this is yes, they already are. Although maybe for no military is this perfect. Is any military doing this perfectly? But I want to make it clear that saying heritage is not a legitimate military target does not mean that it sort of belongs to no one or is outside of oversight, for lack of better words. But that they should be dealt, dark heritage or problematic heritage should be the realm of consensus or politics or referendum, rather than a legitimate military target. And for example, the Ukrainians are mindful of protecting their own heritage, of course. The question will be, in their incursion into Kursk, are they similarly protecting Russian heritage across the border? And one hopes that the efforts they're extending to civilians to provide humanitarian aid to Russian citizens and non-combatants and help with evacuation, that they are also applying the lessons of identifying only military targets and targeting only military targets more broadly, right? So protecting civilian infrastructure, for which heritage is one aspect. It makes sense. This is in the sense that protecting heritage is a good information weapon. Why wouldn't you?
Oh, excellent. Major, do you have a response?
Yes, I would say that we're talking a lot of center of gravity, and the center of gravity, so the most important uh, part for the Ukraine is actually the Western support. And so if they don't, or if they would break the humanitarian law or the protection of cultural property by attacking Russia, for example, with their drones or so, this would, I think, be a danger for the support. And we see that the Ukraine, they're attacking the oil infrastructure, they're attacking military objectives. We don't see any symbolic or cultural targets. We had this one drone attack. Ukraine didn't say that they were against the Kremlin. If you remember, but this was more a symbolic attack. There was no damage. Nobody was hurt. But there was no attack against cultural heritage, Russian heritage. So I think the Ukraine is very eager to maintain the Western support, and that's why the strategic advice would be to continue this way.
Thank you. Dr. Kaiser, do you have questions for our speakers?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to both of you for the insights into your work. I was actually wondering one thing, or have a question for the three of you. So UNESCO has verified 69 damaged heritage sites in the Kharkiv region, going back to Major Rentenberger's focus on that region. Major, you mentioned that we have to distinguish between collateral damage and intentional damage. And if we now only think about collateral damage, would it have been possible to save this cultural heritage from a purely military perspective? And you all have military background. Would it have been possible to leave this cultural heritage, these sites, out of harm's way, include this into the planning process, into all the military maneuvers that were conducted? Or was it without any chance to leave this heritage out of harm's way? Maybe a very provocative question, but I think that's also what we're here for, and I take the possibility and the liberty to pose this provocative one.
So I will not go into the details, but the target process that we have in NATO countries actually, and that we are also teaching in Austrian Armed Forces, consists that we have this collateral damage assessment. So before you attack a target, you have to do this collateral damage estimate, and then there is also, of course, the legal advisor who will take a closer look if this is legally okay to attack or not. But one problem that we have, and there is no solution for that, I think, is if you attack with drones and you have such massive attacks like we see it now, you cannot protect, and we don't have any tools to prevent that. If you're shooting them down with air defense and the debris are falling down, so this is you cannot know where this debris is coming down, where they could hurt civilian population or cultural heritage, cultural property. So this is a problem because the whole targeting process was also always against enemies who didn't have any countermeasures. So this is I would say, a new lesson that we should learn, that this debris or this defense of massive attacks can also hurt or destroy people and heritage. So there isn't, for that, I have no solution actually.
Dr. Harrell?
I could not agree more with the comment about chiding inbound missiles. Like, there's no predicting the fallout from that, and actually civilians and civilian infrastructure are being impacted by that debris as well. You know, to my mind, people have asked and in some instances made the case about whether Russia is destroying Ukrainian cultural heritage along the same lines or under the banner of actively destroying heritage, the way that ISIS attacked cultural heritage in Syria, like intentionally targeting it. And to my mind, the patterns of destruction have honestly suggested that the Russian targeting of Ukrainian cultural heritage is not actually intentional targeting for the most part. It is in step with their destruction of all civilian infrastructure, schools, libraries, health facilities, places of government. Like, yes, in some instances, the Russians have appeared to have intentionally targeted heritage for heritage sake, but they also seem intent on destroying like Ukrainian personhood, for which heritage is that mirror, right? So with that in mind, I think the question becomes extremely difficult to answer, similar to the problem of how does one try an inbound missile without affecting anyone when you go to stop it? How do you do this over empty land? Because how do you enforce Ukrainian sovereignty against an adversary that refuses to recognize it in violation of international law that they signed those treaties as well? And for under that is how I think protecting heritage has to happen, is part of a wider conversation about doing the war legally, essentially, on the side of on the part of the Russians, and enforcing that.
Thank you. We have some questions coming in, and I think Dr. Harrell and the Major have done a brilliant job of addressing your question, Dr. Kaiser. Is it right if I move to some questions from our participants?
Please.
Yeah. So our first question is from a person from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And they're asking, they'd like the views of both presenters on the nexus between conflict and trafficking in cultural property as a form of organized crime.
Okay, so Murat, great to see you in here. Hello. I will say some comments and then basically put a pin in this for a forthcoming CURIA report. So advertisement for a forthcoming report. But as I'm sure no one will be surprised in this room to hear, there is widespread tolerance and even encouragement within, for example, Russian Federation Armed Forces and their collaborators to participate in criminal activity, not just of antiquities, but of trafficking in all kinds of different things, and moving those antiquities out of occupied Ukraine through Russia and into places like Europe, into the United States, and into Asia. I think here the problem is much older than 2022. People like Dr. Sam Hardy, who's in our research group, have been documenting this since 2014, since the occupation of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, and it's well established now. It's essentially part of the business model, and there's a focus on getting, for example, Western countries, the United States, to change their import restrictions in order to stop the flow of trafficking. In my mind, either enforcement has to really ante up as a solution to this, or honestly, Ukraine needs to reclaim those territories and address what is now organized crime. Because I see a line being drawn between like even when the authorities are able to seize trafficked materials, they are going back to Ukraine, and that is just waiting in a line of thousands of other war crimes to be investigated. Like the volume is really high, and it is a low priority for investigation because, I mean, for the most part, it's kind of hard to track down lines of illicit trafficking, the networks, excuse me. So a lot of work has to be done in that area. And it's a hard problem to solve. It's sort of an outcome of the instability in the area. Turning over to the major.
Sir,
Any thoughts?
So
Yeah.
crime, and this is not so much the military domain, so I have nothing to add to this question. I think it was well answered again.
We have another question. The monuments that the Russian military built, are these objects in Russia or in Ukraine?
They're building them in Ukraine.
Okay, in the occupied territories?
Exactly.
All right. Okay, we have a question for let's see. Oh, here's another. The new Russian monuments are not to be considered military targets. Is this about the perception of these objects?
Okay, I love this question. Yes, I think you could argue it's about the perception, but honestly, I would say how I'm thinking about this is not about the perception of these objects. It's the fact that I don't think the military should determine that they are legitimate military targets and then feel free to attrite them. I think this is a social and political decision that should be left up to governments and the people that vote in those governments, right? For example, the statue of Catherine the Great that was taken down in Odessa, and I think 2020, at the end of 2022, I might be wrong, it might have been 2023. There's a statue of Catherine the Great, a public monument of Catherine the Great in Odessa. It was voted on by while the people of Odessa were being attacked by airstrikes, they held a referendum about what to do with the statue, and they voted to take her down, and they did. That's where I think the solution for if monuments are perceived, to use the word of the question, if monuments are perceived not to reflect the social truth anymore, right? As new social truths emerge, if they're perceived to not reflect that, and local citizens no longer want them in their public spaces, that is a political decision. That is not a military one, is what I mean. I hope that makes sense. But Major, I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this question and whether you agree.
Well, I just want to give an example. In the city of Vienna, we have this monument of the Russian or the Soviet soldier for the liberation from 45 on the Schwarzenbergplatz, perhaps you know it. And it was very interesting. There was not a big, in the media, it's not a big echo, but several days after the invasion in 2022, behind the wall behind this soldier, this big statue with a fountain, there was the colors of the Ukrainian flag. And this was a very interesting, I would say, solution, because we should remember the history, so don't forget what happened in the past, but to put it in a context, and I think it was a very smooth or smart way to handle the situation. I don't know who it was, and I don't know if it was even from the government or if somebody did. I don't know this background, but I'm passing there. I drove there with my car, and I thought to myself, well, this is quite a smart or smooth idea to handle this situation.
If I can cheekily plug a paper I co-authored with my colleague and intellectual superior, Damian Koropecki, for the Antiquities Coalition a couple of years ago. The theme of our paper is, what role should heritage professionals play when monuments are being taken down? And this acts of recontextualization of public monuments is a very valid way to answer the question of, what do these monuments mean to us now? So I'll put the link in the chat. It's freely available. But my point is that there is no one solution to these problems, even if the problem occurs essentially everywhere there's been a colonialist space, which is a lot of the world. For those reasons, I do not think that the military should see them as military targets. Like, this is not a decision for the military to make. It's a decision for the people to make. So I love this recontextualization of the Ukrainian flag up against the Soviet sculpture. It's phenomenal.
Yeah. Outstanding. So with that, I would like to thank all of our participants, again, our Spotlight organizers, and especially the brilliant presentations and brilliant answers to the questions by both Major Albin Rentenberger and Dr. Katherine Harrell. And so we look forward to future opportunities to continue these kinds of important discussions. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Close. Yep.